My name is Marcus Hale. I'm 51 years old. I've always been the kind of man who builds quietly. No flashy talk, no bragging. I was raised by a single mother who taught me to work with my hands and never depend on anyone else's approval to feel valuable. I married young, built a custom home from the ground up, and spent 27 years making sure my wife and stepdaughter never had to lift a finger. I thought that loyalty, consistency, and protection would be enough. I thought wrong. The shift was gradual, the kind that creeps in like a slow leak behind the wall. Subtle, silent, and dangerous. My wife's tone started changing first. A few missed thank yous, a few too many you wouldn't understand. Then her family started coming around more often, speaking in hushed tones when I entered the room. At first I thought I was being paranoid, but when my brother-in-law came over one evening with a suitcase and no warning, I knew something was off. Still, I said nothing. I watched. I didn't say a word, not one. I looked at the boxes, then back at the woman I had spent half my life protecting. I looked at her mother, who used to call me son. I even looked at my stepdaughter, who couldn't even meet my eyes. And then I smiled. A small, quiet smile. I picked up one box, the one with the photo album, and I walked out the door without slamming it. I didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me break, because I wasn't broken. I was free. I checked into a quiet extended stay hotel with a kitchenette and a view of the back alley. It wasn't glamorous, but it was peaceful. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was walking on eggshells. I didn't have to ask anyone's permission to breathe. That night I sat at the window with a cup of black coffee, looking out into the dark, and I whispered to myself, let them live in what they think they've won. Because here's the truth most people don't understand. When you betray a man who's done nothing but give, you're not taking power, you're triggering a reckoning. And some reckonings don't come with thunder. Some come quietly and completely. There's a kind of ache that comes not from losing a house, but from realizing the people you built it for were never really home. I spent the first few days walking through memories in my mind, like a ghost wandering his own graveyard. Every beam in that house was nailed by my own hands. Every holiday we ever celebrated, every birthday I planned, every late-night grocery run when they were sick. That was me. I wasn't a perfect man, but I showed up, and in the end, none of it mattered. I remember the night my stepdaughter called me Dad for the first time. She was 6. Her real father hadn't shown up for her school play, and I was the one sitting in the second row with flowers and a camcorder. I didn't hesitate. I gave her everything. Love, security, stability. But somewhere along the way, her loyalty shifted. Maybe it was subtle, maybe it wasn't. But when I looked at her face that day, in the living room, I realized something painful. She had chosen blood over bond. As for my wife, I'd seen it coming. Not the eviction, but the detachment. Her laughter used to be warm and unfiltered. Over the past year it had grown colder, more calculated, like it was always for show. I caught her whispering to her mother on the phone late at night, stopping conversations when I entered the room. I remember thinking, she's not cheating on me. She's just planning something I'm not supposed to hear. I brushed it off because that's what loyal men do. They give the benefit of the doubt until the benefit becomes the cost. There's a dangerous silence that follows betrayal. Not the silence of shock, but the silence of clarity. You begin to visit every ignored red flag, every time you swallowed your instinct for the sake of peace, and you start to see the difference between being a peacemaker and being a fool. I wasn't angry, I wasn't bitter, I was deeply, profoundly disappointed, and that's a far more dangerous emotion, because disappointment doesn't lash out, it plots. I didn't call anyone. I didn't post anything online. I didn't try to explain my side. I just sat with the weight of the truth. I had poured decades into people who saw me as disposable the moment it was convenient. That kind of pain doesn't come with tears. It comes with decisions. Decisions about how you're going to respond, how you're going to rebuild, and how you're going to make sure that the people who tried to bury you live long enough to see the tree grow from the soil they left you in. So I made a promise to myself, not to hurt them, not to get even, but to outlive the lie, to rise so quietly, so intelligently, that one day they'd look back and realize the foundation they stood on was never theirs to begin with. They didn't take the house. They just locked themselves inside a sinking ship. I didn't rush into anything. That's how people ruin good revenge. They move too fast, speak too soon, or let their pride leak through cracks of pain. But I waited, I observed, and slowly pieces began falling into place. The house they kicked me out of, it wasn't in my wife's name, it wasn't in her mother's name, it wasn't in her brother's name either. It was in a trust, a legal structure I'd set up years ago for tax purposes and long-term protection. And guess who the sole trustee was? They thought I was simple, just a blue-collar man who worked with his hands and stayed quiet. But I'd spent my nights reading books about real estate law and asset protection. I'd watched friends lose everything in messy divorces, and I promised myself I'd never let that happen to me. That house, the one they were now throwing parties in, was still legally mine. But I didn't march back in. I let them get comfortable, because nothing destroys entitlement like premature celebration. I contacted a lawyer I trusted, a quiet man who didn't ask unnecessary questions. I showed him the trust documents, the original deed, the financial paper trail. We didn't file anything yet. We didn't make noise. We just reviewed every legal angle, every clause, every loophole. I wanted this to be clean, not just a win, but a lesson. Not out of spite, but out of principle. If you betray someone who built the walls around you, you should at least learn how those walls were held up. In the meantime, I opened a new bank account, transferred my personal funds, and left joint accounts untouched. I knew she would drain them. She always had a way of assuming everything was hers. I even watched as they listed my tools and equipment for sale online, posting them like they were clutter to be cleared out. I smiled. Those tools were marked with hidden identifiers, serial numbers, custom engravings, receipts in my name. I took screenshots of every listing, but the real move came when I visited the county records office, quietly, alone. I requested a property title history. My name was still there, bold, unchallenged. And while they had possession, I still had ownership. That's the mistake people make, confusing access with authority. Letting someone stay in your house doesn't mean it's no longer yours. I watched the paper slide across the desk and felt a stillness settle in my chest. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about reclaiming the narrative. I knew I wouldn't need to raise my voice. I wouldn't need to bang on the door or demand they leave. When the time came, they'd remove themselves out of panic, out of shame, or by force of law. And I'd be waiting, not to gloat, but to walk back in with the same quiet dignity I left with. That's the kind of power you earn when you've been underestimated long enough. Silent power. The kind that doesn't need an audience, because the victory is already written. It started with a letter, a formal notice from my attorney, delivered quietly, professionally, and with no emotion, just facts. It stated clearly that the property they were living in was held in a legal trust and that the trust's sole trustee had never authorized them to reside there. They had 7 days to vacate. No negotiation, no discussion, just a deadline. I imagined the moment they opened it, the sudden silence, the cold rush of reality replacing their smug comfort. That was the beginning. On day 3, I received a panicked call from my stepdaughter. She didn't even say hello. Just, "What is this letter?" Her voice cracked, not from sadness, but from entitlement losing its footing. I didn't yell. I didn't explain. I said simply, "It's the truth." Then I hung up. That silence, the one I left her with, said more than any speech could. Because people like them aren't used to consequences. They're used to emotional manipulation. But this time, I'd removed emotion entirely. My wife, or ex-wife I should say, since she'd quietly filed for divorce once she thought she had the house, tried a different angle. She called my lawyer directly, pretending to be apologetic, then threatening legal action, then begging to negotiate. But the paperwork was airtight. I had protected every brick, every nail. She had assumed that being cruel in private would protect her in public. She didn't realize I'd been documenting everything: texts, voicemails, even the change in behavior captured on our home security system. By the end of the week, her brother, the one who smugly told me to go to the dump, was the first to leave. He packed up in the middle of the night and vanished. Cowards usually do. My ex-mother-in-law followed shortly after, yelling something about calling the news and exposing me. But what could she say? That the man who built the house legally reclaimed it after being thrown out like trash. That wasn't a scandal. That was justice. On the final day, my wife stood alone in the driveway. No more guests, no more laughter. Just boxes, tears, and the same silence I had once walked away in. I watched from my truck parked across the street, not out of cruelty, but out of closure. She looked at the house like it had betrayed her, but it hadn't. She had betrayed herself. The walls she tried to claim had only ever echoed with the voice of the man who built them, me. When the house was empty, I stepped back inside. The air was stale, but the structure was strong, just like me. I didn't touch anything at first. I just stood in the entryway, remembering the man I used to be, the one who gave too much, trusted too blindly, and I whispered, "We're home now." Not just me, but the version of me that had risen from quiet ashes. The house wasn't the victory. The man who came back to it was. In the days that followed, the silence around them grew louder. I didn't need to speak a word. Their actions spoke for themselves. My ex-wife tried to save face in our community, spinning stories about misunderstandings, framing herself as the victim of a cold-hearted husband who took everything. But people talk, and truth, like water, always finds its level. Friends she thought were loyal began to pull away. Invitations dried up. Her mother's smug phone calls stopped. The silence became her mirror. The fallout didn't come in flames. It came in fragments. She had built her comfort on the illusion of permanence, believing the home would always be hers, the respect automatic, the loyalty unconditional. But once the truth surfaced, she was left with no leverage. Her job had been shaky, even before the split, and with the stress, she started missing days. Her brother, who once bragged about running things from the living room couch, ended up sleeping on a friend's floor. I didn't touch any of them. I didn't have to. That's the thing about quiet revenge. It doesn't destroy, it reveals. It shows people who they really are when their masks are gone and their audience disappears. I watched from a distance as my ex-wife tried to secure another place to live, but with no legal tie to the house, no savings of her own, and a credit history that leaned on mine for decades, she found herself hitting walls. All the comfort she once enjoyed was never hers. It was borrowed, and the lender had returned. I never gloated. I never sent a message. I never posted anything online. I lived my life like they never existed. I rebuilt slowly, room by room, restoring the house not for nostalgia but for renewal. I removed furniture with memories too heavy to carry. I repainted the walls. I even planted a tree out front. Something strong and unshakable. something that would outlive the noise. Every morning I'd stand by the window with coffee in hand, peaceful, not because I'd won, but because I hadn't let them break me. I began to sleep deeper, not just because the house was quiet again, but because my mind finally rested. When you spend years on edge, constantly making yourself smaller to keep the peace, you forget what freedom feels like. But now, the air itself felt lighter. No passive-aggressive silence, no forced small talk. Just me, the house I built, and the man I became, because of what I endured. That's not bitterness, that's clarity. And in that clarity, I learned the most important truth of all. People can take things from you, but they can't take what's rooted inside you. They can betray your kindness, mock your silence, and weaponize your love. But they can never own the ground you built for yourself. Sometimes the greatest revenge is simply moving on. Not away from a place, but away from the version of yourself that tolerated things you should have questioned sooner. That's what I began to understand as the months passed. My house no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a sanctuary. I started volunteering at a local woodshop program for at-risk teens. Quietly, anonymously, teaching young boys how to work with their hands, how to measure twice and cut once, not just in carpentry but in life. They didn't need to know my story, they could feel it in the way I guided them, in the way I spoke with patience instead of bitterness. That became my legacy, not a war won, but a seed planted. Healing doesn't come with fanfare. It comes in small moments. A morning with no anxiety, a room that holds peace instead of memories, a conversation with yourself that ends in grace, not regret. That's what I learned, and in learning it I became a different kind of man, not harder, not colder, but wiser, lighter, and more dangerous in the best way, untouchable by betrayal, because I'd already walked through fire and refused to scream. So now, I live quietly, I keep the lights soft, I read more, I cook for myself, I play jazz on Sundays, and when I pass a mirror, I no longer see the man who was discarded. I see the man who rebuilt, alone, and did it better. That's the part no one tells you about peace. It's not just freedom from others, it's the moment you stop seeking apology, because you've already given yourself closure. The first message came late at night. A single sentence from my stepdaughter, "Can we talk?" I stared at it for a while, not because I was angry, but because I was no longer available for that version of the past. She had made her choice, stood in silence when I was discarded like a stranger. Now that reality had humbled her, she was knocking on a door that no longer existed. A few days later, my ex-wife sent a longer message. She said she was sorry for how things ended and that she hoped I was healing. It sounded rehearsed, like she'd read an article on closure and was performing the part. There was no accountability, just vague words meant to clear her conscience, not acknowledge the damage. I didn't reply, not because I hated her, but because the version of me who needed her explanation had already healed without it. That's what people don't understand about real healing. It doesn't look like revenge. It looks like indifference wrapped in peace. When you stop needing someone to acknowledge the pain they caused, it means you've outgrown the version of yourself they had power over. That was me now. I wasn't cold. I was simply unavailable to chaos. And that silence? It was louder than any speech I could have delivered. They kept trying in small ways. Like on an old photo, a mutual friend accidentally running into me and asking how I was. I saw through it. It wasn't about reconnection, it was about curiosity. They wanted to know if I was still broken, still licking my wounds. But there were no wounds left, just wisdom, just distance, just a man who had turned pain into purpose. There's something sacred about disappearing from the radar of those who tried to destroy you, not by hiding, but by rising so quietly, so steadily, that they can't even track your elevation. That's what I became. A mystery. A name they mentioned less and less, because every mention reminded them of their own reflection. And when you make peace your weapon, your absence becomes a haunting. I didn't need revenge. I became something more terrifying than revenge, a reminder. A reminder that not everyone who walks away is weak. Some of us walk away to protect our power and return when we've built an empire on the silence you thought would bury us. I started drawing blueprints again. Not for homes, but for people. Young men, former addicts, kids fresh out of juvie. They'd come to the shop unsure of themselves, hands trembling, voices too loud or too soft. I taught them that building something steady with your hands can quiet the chaos in your mind. That discipline isn't punishment, it's freedom. I didn't give speeches. I gave examples. Some days I'd look around the workshop and smile. These boys didn't know my story. They didn't know I'd been thrown out by people I called family. They just knew I showed up on time, taught with care, and never yelled. And in their progress, I saw something sacred, redemption, not through revenge, but through usefulness, through rebuilding others, while staying whole myself. One afternoon, one of the boys asked, "Why do you give your Saturdays to us?" I looked at him and said, "Because someone gave me their silence when I needed answers. And I don't want you to wait for anyone to give you what you can build yourself." He nodded. He understood in a way that words couldn't reach. And in that moment I felt my story shift from survival to service. I never published my story, never turned it into a blog or a book. It stayed with me like a scar, visible only if I rolled up my sleeves. But it taught me that quiet men are not weak men, that a life lived with intention will always echo louder than a scream made in pain, and that the greatest flex isn't winning, it's walking away with grace.
My ex-wife remarried.
I heard it through someone else, a smaller man. From what I was told, the kind who flashes success but folds under weight. I didn't feel jealousy, I felt confirmation. Some people aren't looking for real men, they're looking for mirrors to reflect their illusions. Let her have that. I've outgrown illusions. Because now I don't just live in the house I built, I live in the peace I carved out of betrayal. And that peace, that's the legacy no one can steal. I think back sometimes to that moment in the living room. The boxes, the smirks, the sentence "go to the dump," and I wonder what would have happened if I had shouted, thrown things, cried. Maybe it would have made good TV. But it wouldn't have made me whole. Instead, I took the path that looked weak, but turned out to be bulletproof. That's the lesson most people never learn. That power isn't found in how loud you can respond, it's found in how still you can stand. That's what kept me steady. When the world stripped me of comfort, I clung to character. When they thought they'd humiliated me, they accidentally handed me clarity. And when they walked me to the edge, I realized I had wings. I didn't win because I fought back. I won because I didn't flinch. I didn't explain. I didn't beg. I didn't give them the satisfaction of watching me unravel. I gave them something far more haunting: silence, and a future they'd never be invited into. That's the kind of revenge only healed men understand. And now, years later, I still rise before dawn, still drink my coffee with quiet gratitude, still walk barefoot across the wood floors I once feared I'd never see again. I don't speak of them. I don't chase closure. I live fully, steadily, joyfully, and that joy, it was born from the ashes of everything they tried to burn. I'm not the man who was thrown out. I'm the man who rebuilt, without shouting, without begging, without turning cruel. That is strength. That is power. That is peace. And it's mine forever. I don't keep souvenirs of what happened. No letters, no photos, No pieces of that broken chapter. My story isn't a museum of pain. It's a blueprint for men who feel invisible, underestimated, discarded. If you're listening, know this. You don't have to shout to prove you matter. You don't have to break things to show your strength. You just have to keep building when no one believes you can. And one day, they'll look up and realize you became something they can't touch. I walk the halls of my home now with ease. No tension, no guessing games. I light a fire in the evenings, cook my own meals, and listen to the kind of music that makes the walls breathe. Sometimes I dance